It's a good afternoon. Okay. Good afternoon. We are ready to begin our final panel with this evening, almost evening. So we're gonna. This is it's a packed panel, as you can see, many participants. So I'm not gonna read you the bios of all the participants. I'm just gonna name you who's gonna be participating, starting with me. Very briefly, I would say extremely briefly things. Well, I'm Juan Espino. I'm faculty here at Vídeo. And it's my pleasure to introduce, first of all, Blanca Heredia, who needs no introduction. If you allow me, I can skip you.
Vídeo has already done that. So.
Excellent. Then the second paper is going to be presented by Sebastián Garrido and Javier Rojas, who are also faculty here at CIDE. Marco Hernandez is going to present, he's a professor at Tech, which is a university that's around here, for those of you who are not from Mexico. Then Lucrecia Santibáñez from Claremont Graduate University is also going to be presenting on teacher evaluation. And finally, we're going to have a pair of discussants. First of all, Carlos Elizondo. Okay, so only Carlos Elizondo, who's also a professor at Tech, but who was a professor here at CIDE and Dean for a long time, so it's a pleasure to have him back. Without further ado, please, I'm just going to give you 15 minutes each, 15 minutes tops, because as you can see, we're already very late, and then it's a lot of people presenting. So I'm going to be exercising my authority after 15 minutes, and I'm going to be making signs, and you'll notice it. Okay, so we're going to begin with you, Blanca, please.
Okay, while we get the presentation ready, let me tell you a few words about the guest institution.
CIDE, Centro de Investigación y Docencia Económicas, where we're at, is a public higher institution, research, like a research university, specializing in the social sciences. It is by far, I would say, the most important research university, public research university in the social sciences. We do academic research, we do teaching, we have BA programs, master's programs, and PhD programs, and we also do a lot of work that attempts and seeks to influence policymaking in a number of domains. We have an economics department, political science, history, law, public administration, and a number of other ones. And PIPE is the research unit of CIDE that specializes in education and education policy. It was created almost 3 years ago. We've been fortunate to be able to hire a number of very good young researchers, and we do work that focuses on education, and some of it more specifically on education policy, but the idea is very much to be able to produce research that speaks to policymakers, that could be of interest to policymakers. So I hope, at some other point we'll have time to tell you a bit more, but at least that brief introduction, which I didn't do at the very beginning. Okay, The framework I presented in the first session today. And as you may recall, the two main questions was why so many countries embarked on this very difficult and politically risky reforms having to do with raising educational quality, improving educational quality, which are very different from reforms or measures that have more to do with expanding access to educational services or to educational resources. When you have an expanding pie, the politics tend to be a bit more benign than when you're affecting the core interests of key stakeholders in the educational domain, such as, for instance, teacher unions, educational bureaucrats, clientelistic-based politicians or parties. And today I'm going to present, I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of the Mexican educational system, of the reforms themselves, and then go and try to use the Mexican case to show, at least initially, that I think that the framework I proposed in the first paper might be helpful in terms of helping us identify the reasons/causes behind the decision of government to embark upon these very risky, politically risky reforms, and also how the particular motivation might affect the contents of the policy, the priorities over time, and also, and I think critically important, the strategies. Whether it's speak more of a confrontation or a cooperation strategy, and whether it's more of a strategy that focuses primarily on deflecting opposition, or it's one that also includes building positive support for the reform that might allow it to be effective and sustainable in the long run. Okay, first, and particularly for our foreign guests, just a little bit of a sense of the country. This is a fairly large country, population-wise, almost 130 million, ranking by GDP, number 15 in the world. Our per capita GDP is almost 10,000, population below 15 years is almost 30%, and population 65 years and older is still small but growing. The educational system. Mexico's educational system is the 5th largest in the world. This is not something I just say because I want to say it, but it's critically important. The scale of this system is a critical consideration when you're thinking of anything educational. You have to multiply it by this number. So in terms of resources, in terms of veto points or chains of command, in terms of number of students, the infrastructure part, you're really talking about a huge system. So we have overall 23 million students in basic education, that's preschool, primary and lower secondary. And then we have also many teachers, almost 1.2 million. These are just teachers. The figure I gave you about CENTES, the National Union's membership, also includes teachers in other school levels, and also clerical workers and educational workers of different sorts. So the 1.8 million is the membership of the National Teachers Union, and this one is the teachers, just the teachers. Okay, this is a bit of a profile of the Mexican teachers. So the average age is 42 years. In average, they have 15 years of experience. 61% of them have a specific pedagogical training or teacher training. 87% works in public schools, and 91% of them have a BA degree. This is TALI's data, and as you know, all of the OECD data is ultimately government data that governments provide to the OECD, right? Mexico has very serious educational deficits. Just to give you a sense, I did not want to, put all of the tables, but just to give you a sense, people that out of all of the population, people that are older than 15 years that either don't know how to read or write, or that have not finished lower secondary education is almost 6 million people. So we have grave educational deficits. In addition to that, the quality as measured by PISA scores is not good. Welcome. And there's not been much progress. There was a little bit of progress significant progress in math from 2000 to 2009 in particular, but generally there's not been much progress. The gap between Mexico and the rest of the world is also quite significant. Mexico regularly comes out the last among the OECD countries in all editions of PISA, and the percentage of students below level 2, which as you all know is below the level where someone is ready to go to the next school year or to participate in the labor market, or to have the ability not only, say for instance in reading, to decode words, but to actually use reading to learn, as Andrea Schleicher, who was here 2 days ago, put it, is super high. But for math, that's over 50% and has been so for quite some time. And the same goes for all of the literacies measured by PISA. I'm just here looking at the 2015 numbers. One thing I just want to point out is that Mexico has a very large percentage of its student population below level 2. But it's more or less in the ballpark of other countries with a similar per capita income. Where we're really off the charts is in the very, very small number of high-performing students. This includes, of course, children of higher economic means. So we have a general quality problem, not only among the children coming from disadvantaged families, but also rich kids. And just to give you one very easy way to put it, the highest percentile of Mexican students in terms of their scores in PISA 2015 are below the mean scores of the lowest 10% of Vietnamese children. Did I make myself clear? The richest 10% of Mexicans do less well than the poorest Vietnamese. So our quality problem is not only circumscribed to children coming from underprivileged backgrounds. For addressing Mexico's deficits, there have been various attempts to do something about it, okay? And mostly, more or less every 10 years, there's been major curricular changes. We do this, it's like a national sport. We do this huge curricular changes, and nothing much changed. So it was clear that curricular change, as important as it is, was insufficient. Spending more also did not seem to work very well in terms of improving the quality of learning outcomes, especially when there are so many irregularities in the way that spending is done. And these are just a few numbers coming out of the first national census, almost 200 years after the first census in education performed by Britain at the first half of the 19th century. But we now have a national census of school students. And this was part of the reform I will be talking about. And it was a critical part of the reform because the state of disorder in terms of the access to basic information for both the management and for transparency and accountability issues was such that prior to the census there was no clear number that would tell us how many teachers we had actually teaching. It was that bad, okay? But then when we did the census, it turned out that 23% of the teachers had some kind of an irregularity. They were either dead or still getting their payment, or all kinds of irregularities. That's 23%. This is not 2.3. This is 23%, right? Yeah. And then obviously also, well, not obviously, but it also became, it was obvious to the people in the communities, but the country didn't know how badly, in many ways, this money had been spent, because infrastructure had been abandoned, essentially. And we had a very high number of schools without water, without bathroom, and things like that. And this was, of course, and in many cases what happened, and I don't know, I'd be curious to know what happens in other Latin American countries, for instance, Peru. What this did is that if the communities wanted to have a more or less functioning school, they had to pay for it themselves, you know. Okay, so the 2013 quality education reform is really, I think, unprecedented in many ways. It's a big bang reform, it's systemic, it includes multiple components. It has been pushed forward in a relatively short period of time. And it is an incredibly important opportunity to address some of the deficits I mentioned earlier, but it is a long and winding road. The explicit goals of this reform, this is not my framework, this is the explicit what it says in the preamble to the constitutional reform. It says to recuperate the Mexican state authority and steering capacity over the educational system, which it had essentially lost to an informal arrangement between the National Teachers Union and the national bureaucracy that had essentially sort of like completely captured the educational policymaking apparatus. So that was the explicit number one objective of this reform, the idea being we cannot do anything, improve quality or infrastructure or whatever, if we don't recuperate the control to be able to do it. Secondly, it's a paradigm shift. The Mexican state does not have only the constitutional obligation to provide children in Mexico with a seat in a building called school. It must provide them with the opportunity to actually learn. So it's not the right to be in school, it's the right to learn. And the second thing is critical, is that it was going to be merit and not some other clientelistic, which used to be the way to be able to get a teaching post, to get a promotion, and most importantly, to retain a teaching position. This was done through a number of measures. The most important, central, was professional teaching service, complete overhaul. There had been a previous smaller attempt during the previous administration, the Calderón administration, that for the first time ever had open exams, competitive exams for entry into a teaching position, but only for new posts. So it was a minuscule percentage of existing teacher jobs. This time around, this works for all teaching jobs. It applies also to promotion and critically to permanence in your teaching position. There's an autonomous education evaluation agency. We will have the president of that agency tomorrow in our policymakers roundtable, and many other things. I won't go into them. Okay, the political puzzle, as I mentioned in the morning, and is, I think, pretty well established. Quality education reform offers potentially very large benefits for large numbers of people, but high upfront cost and limited political benefits for the governments and politicians actually pushing them through. So this is because of strong resistance on the part of powerful stakeholders, dispersed and often not mobilized beneficiaries, and protracted maturation periods. Why would political principles be willing to incur the costs and risks of doing this when it's so difficult to get it done, and so difficult to, once you've, say, done it, take political credit for doing it? So why would anybody want to commit suicide? Okay, 3 possible motivations: conviction, pressure, and quality education reform, offering governments an opportunity to do something that they really want to do, that is more immediate, and for which they can take credit and benefit more immediately. And this last motivation is the one I think applies to the Mexican case. This does not mean that in reality motivations are mixed, or that if you have an ulterior motivation, you're actively and militantly against quality education. I'm not saying that, okay? I'm just saying that for me to understand politically these kinds of experiences, it makes sense to think of them as, in some cases, providing politicians means to gain some other goal that is of more immediate concern to them. And even, making room analytically for these kinds of strategies might be a good idea, because not all good things are the product of the best intentions. Okay, so primary motivation, other political goals. Which ones? The 3 main ones I am hypothesizing is, first of all, to strengthen state capacity and room of maneuver for government by limiting the growing power of what in Spanish and in Mexico we call poderes fácticos, which are extremely strong vested interests, which had seen their power grow exponentially as a result of 3 main factors: the shift towards open markets in the 80s and 90s, decentralization, political decentralization, and ultimately the move towards greater political electoral competition. And sort of like a reduction of state power vis-a-vis these poderes fácticos that became increasingly powerful. And all politicians came to realize that no matter who was sitting in the chair, in the presidential chair, nobody was being able to govern because these poderes fácticos had become so incredibly powerful. So they were all in agreement that they needed to be limited. And a central one among those poderes fácticos was the National Teachers Union. The second one, and this is absolutely critical, there was this unprecedented and I think pretty surprising opportunity that opened up at the end of 2012 that allowed the government and its party to sit in a negotiating table with the 2 main opposition parties, PAN and PRD, to negotiate a very broad package of structural reforms, and that provided the setting in which might have, including telecoms, energy, taxes, financial transactions, 11 sectors. And it provided government, this is my second hypothesis, with an absolutely key bargaining chip to get support from the other parties in order to be able to pass its 2 main priorities. Tax reform. Mexico has a very low tax base. Here's one of the world experts on the matter, Carlos Elizondo, can tell us more. And then also energy reform, critically important. So education reform was a tit for tat, kind of quid pro quo thing in order to be able to get those the support of those parties for. And finally, and this I am not sure, but I have, I think, sufficient evidence to say that at least we can put it there up as a hypothesis, one that was not shared with the other parties, but I think that on the part of at least part of the government and part of the dominant party, the PRI, there was the motivation of trying to use the education reform to reassert corporatist, centralized control over the National Teachers Union, which had been the traditional status quo ante prior to 1992. Okay, so the other facilitating conditions, I spoke about them briefly in the morning: strong global consensus on the centrality of education, instruments to define it, to measure it, all of that. And then we had a domestic context in which quality education had been growing in visibility and salience in the public and policy agenda. And this, I would say, and some of us here were very close to this process, I think PISA was extraordinarily important, as in Peru, in putting this thing in the agenda, we might have had some idea that there was problems with educational quality, but as soon as the numbers came out, you know, you could see in the rankings and the comparisons. And also, there have been a number of civil society organizations and experts, the most important of which Mexicanos Primero, David Calderon here, Executive Director of Mexicanos Primero, that was extremely important in pushing this subject in the agenda. But there was a number of other civil society organizations and experts that did that too. Okay, the hypothesized primary motivations help shed light on the reform priorities and the revolution over time. Clearly, first 2 years, almost practically single priority was teacher path, careers reform. You know, the teacher evaluations. That was the key thing. After that, and especially as you started to face increasing governability issues because the dissident faction of the National Union started to become its protest and its opposition increasingly violent, I think, especially from 2015, at the end of 2015 onwards, you see a shift. It's not like we lose any interest in teacher evaluation. That continues to be central, but the agenda diversifies. And infrastructure becomes very important, the honey part. No? I'm not saying this pejoratively, but politically. It's easier to sell politically the infrastructure or teacher training, spending much more on teacher training or the new curricular content. That is more, it's less complicated politically than the teacher career reforms. And then finally, in terms of how these hypothesized motivation might help explain the different strategies. Well, it seems to me that in the case of Mexico, it's very clear that there was an initial kind of a la Mexicana cooperation scheme, which was you're going to cooperate, namely you're going to obey after I have jailed your leader, okay? And that was the kind of cooperation with the National Union, because they jailed the leader, this El Bester Gordillo. And there was also kind of cooperation, but it was basically kind of cooptation with the dissident fraction, with a different ministry, the Ministry of the Interior, that kept giving them money and other concessions to try to quiet them down without any success. And then it became more confrontational, particularly with the dissident factions, but ultimately that led to a very grave governability crisis. And then the last thing is that I think it also helps shed light on the much greater emphasis that you see in the Mexican reform, in contrast, for instance, to Peru or other experiences, on the deflecting opposition rather than getting support. And I'll end there. It really, when it hit me about a few months ago, that I could not identify like any winner in this reform, I thought, we're in trouble. How are you going to sustain an educational reform that has not been able to produce winners? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Blanca. Our next paper is going to zero in on a subject that was touched by Blanca, which is the very tense relationship between governments and unions. So, without further ado.
Hello, my name is Javier Rojas, and I will be presenting some research that I am doing with my colleague Sebastián Garrido, who is also here. We're both professors at CIDE. So, the title of our presentation is A Tale of Two Tracks, Education Reform and Government-Union Relations in Mexico. The purpose of this paper, this presentation, is to analyze the adaptation strategies that the CENTE followed during the different phases of the education reform in Mexico. What we try to understand is how these interactions with the federal government in particular affected the course of the education, the trajectory of the education reform. Now, just some background, especially for our international participants here. CENTE, which is the teachers union in Mexico, it's virtually a monopoly. Why? Because it was created in 1943 as a corporatist and officially sanctioned monopolistic union. That means that its leaders had to be approved by the state. It has had 4 leaders in 64 years. I mean, even though there's some alternation. Basically, you have very long moral leaderships. CENTE represents about 1.9 million members. This is something important to keep in mind because we are talking about workers at the service of education. From out of these almost 1.9 million members, 1.2 are teachers. Okay, CENTE has presence all over the country. As Blanca was telling us, it's basically an army all over the country. Now, something to keep in mind is that even though it's a virtual monopoly, because they are only, CENTE is the only union entitled to hold negotiations with the federal government, this doesn't mean there is no internal fragmentation. So basically, teachers are represented by a union that is divided between an institutionalist group, which is, I'm going to call it El CENTE, just to avoid confusions. And there's a dissident group, which is called La CENTE, La Coordinadora Nacional de Trabajadores de la Educación. Okay, so those states in blue are La CENTE states. The dissident groups have presence especially in Oaxaca, Michoacán, Guerrero, and Chiapas. Those states that appear in green is where CENTE has some presence. And those in white are where El CENTE, or the institutional group, is the dominant section. Okay? So just remember, El CENTE is the institutionalist one, and La CENTE is the dissident one. And El CENTE is the largest one, yes. So, okay, yes, the education reform, very nice. It's about improving the quality of education. If you read the bill that the president sent to Congress, most of it is inspired the main argument is that Mexico needs to improve the quality of education, the learning of students. And all of the arguments revolve around 2 main issues. The first one is the constitution of an autonomous institute for national evaluation, okay? And also the creation of a teacher's professional career service, el servicio profesional docente. Those are the 2 most important changes. Yes, there is a full-time schools, school autonomy, curricular reform, but if you read the initiative, those are the critical issues at stake. Okay, so now we want to propose you another reading of the education reform. It's not only about improving the quality of education, it's also about, and that's what we are proposing, dismantling at least part of the corporatist pact that CENTE had with the state. So, in the graph, in the figure, as you can see, what we are proposing is that we need to see the education reform as a movement from an old regime to a new one. Reformers obviously push forward, because they want to reach, they want to get into the new regime, but unions want to pull backwards. What was the old regime about, and why that was so important for the union, for CENTE? Well, before the reform, even though it's not its formal name, we have labeled it the Professional Union Members Career Service, because promotions and other types of benefits depended mostly on union loyalty and discipline. It was common for teaching positions to be sold or inherited. CENTE was so powerful that it had representation in joint boards where they could decide which teachers will move in the professional ladder or which teachers will occupy positions. Something very important too is that previous to the reform, people who were occupying positions as teachers, who were actually earning money from as teachers, but that were not giving any kind of class, were actually doing political activities, proselytist activities. They were known as comisionados. And in the old regime, we had a non-autonomous INE. So this change to the new regime, the one that the education reform created, was very important because now promotions and other kind of recognitions for teachers depend on merit, on their performance on evaluations. And as Naga was telling you, something critical that the reform pushed was that even those teachers that were already in service needed to present evaluations every 4 years in order to remain in service. There are no more CENTE-CEP joint boards, at least for teachers. Remember, for the workers of education, that's another story. But for teachers, they don't exist anymore. No more comisionados, and we have an autonomous unit. Okay, so what we are doing here is a case study. We built a social protest database based on an original data set that Lante Consultores gave us. We have been complementing that data set. We also performed some in-depth interviews with reformers and union leaders, and we have, looked at brochures, minutes of meetings, etc. This is a work in progress. It's preliminary evidence, so just keep that in mind. So this is how the social protest looks over time. I'm going to be explaining this with more detail, but just so you can have a basic idea of how it evolved. The first phase deals with the constitutional reform, properly speaking, then with the draft of the secondary legislation at the federal level, then with the subnational adaptation process at the state level, and then with implementation, properly speaking. On the x-axis is the months, and on the y-axis is the number of events we got by month. Okay. So what happened during the constitutional reform? This went from December 2012 till February 2013. So it was a fast-track reform. So the best way to characterize what happens with unions here is that they were in shock. Even though education reform was part of the electoral agenda of the candidates for the presidential election, they were in complete shock. But still, they were able to create some strategies about how they were going to deal with the education reform. So in the case of El CENTE, they made the national expedition in defense of the public school and teachers. The main purpose of this strategy was to improve the branding of the union in the eyes of teachers, because El CENTE was not very attractive, very popular at that time. Something interesting during this time is that they began with the idea that they are going to promote low-impact protests, ranging from silent mobilizations, information campaigns, which is something radical for them because they are the corporativist union. They need to obey the state. On the other hand, we have La CENTE. La CENTE's strategy, their objective was to repeal the education reform, was to finish it. Okay? They devised 3 ways that they were going to deal with the education reform. On the first route is the political one, which consists in a cycle of heavy mobilizations to open up spaces of negotiation with the federal government that then are accompanied by more mobilizations to prove that they are strong. There was a legal route too that consisted in all the legal defense for teachers, and also a pedagogical route, because they thought, they argued that this education reform was not an educational one, it was a labor reform. So, what happened during the constitutional reform? Well, as I was telling you, they were in shock. The reform was approved in 2 months, and something very interesting, tragic for the previous union leader is that the same day that the education reform is published, she was captured and sent to prison. She's still in prison, okay? So, what happened later? Then we have this phase where, okay, we have now the constitutional reform, we need to give life to this reform. How are we going to do it? Here what we want to say is that something important happens, is the emergence of 2 tracks about how the federal government is going to deal with the education reform. And we believe that this affected and affects the actual trajectory of the education reform. On the one hand, the federal government dealt with El Cente through CEP, through the Ministry of Education. And on the other hand, the federal government dealt with the dissident section, La Cente, through SEGOV. This is important. Sorry? The Ministry of Interior. Yes. Oops. Sorry. Okay. So yeah. So okay, and this emerges, during this period because in March of 2013, the federal government decides to acknowledge Juan Díaz de la Torre, as a union leader of El Cente. Juan Díaz de la Torre was apparently involved in all the criminal charges that had to do with El Gordillo. So that was a major decision. And Luis Enrique Miranda Nava at Segov decides to open up the space at the Ministry of Interior to the dissidents. Okay. So, in this period of the secondary legislation, let me see if I am able to. Yeah. Okay, so this is, here the constitutional reform ended. So we see 2 peaks, right? This peak here has to do with the deadline that Congress set itself to produce the 3 bills that were going to give life to the education reform, which was the Ley General de Servicios Profesionales Docente, the teacher's service, also the one for INE, and some modifications to the general law of education. This big is related to protests in Guerrero that intertwine with some other problems in the state that we are going to discuss later. But it was huge because at the very end of this period, this is an image of Zócalo occupied by all the teachers. I mean, this was huge. They were evacuated immediately after. Okay. So let's go to what happened during the subnational process. This is the adaptation of the secondary law. As you can see, there is a decline in activities, right? Mostly because, CENTE, La Cente is recognized as a valid intermediary in 22 states by SEGOV. Well, big drop. This peak, again, this minor peak, is related to the deadline that the states had to harmonize or adapt their own laws. As you can see, one of the objectives of La Cente especially was to delay the adaptation process, and the most nefarious or notorious case is Oaxaca, that took 760 days, almost 760 days to adapt its legislation. Okay, so in terms of implementation, we think that there are two periods. This one has to do with how former Secretary Emilio Traifet dealt with the union. And as you can see here, there was not a lot of activity here, but some of the peaks are related to, again, dynamics in the States. This is related to Ayotzinapa and Guerrero's governor's resignation. This has to do with the transition from FAED to FONED, which was important because the reform also introduced mechanisms that made more transparent how the education budget was spent. And this peak has a lot to do with some recognition problems of some teaching positions in the States. But you know, again, the peak here, and this is a very critical point, is that during 2015, we had the midterm elections, and La Cente said that they were going to boycott the elections. So actually the evaluations were suspended. We thought that it was going to be forever, but then they said that it was not. It was only for some days because they didn't want to put at risk the elections. But after this period, we see some decline, especially because the federal government takes a more confrontational approach, and they are able to gain control of IEPO in Oaxaca, which was critical because they could use money to mobilize teachers in states like Oaxaca. Okay, so what happens when Aurelio Nuño gets into the Ministry of Education? Well, we see the emergence of one track. There was no dialogue the Ministry of Interior, and Aurelio Nuño was someone who was willing to take the rule of law to its full extent. And as you can see, this is the whole picture. This gets really crazy around June and July of 2016. Why? Well, the thing, here's where Aurelio Nuño starts. You know, here, this peak is related to the application of sanctions to teachers who had a strike for several weeks. He was willing to do that. You know, even when we had some tenure evaluations, things were not that bad. But when he decided that he was going to fire teachers who didn't present the evaluations, things began to go crazy. And they get really crazy when they went for the top leaders. And this, you know, basically ends with the tragic events in Nochextlán, you know, that some teachers died and were injured. So just, you know, I'm almost done. Just to get an idea of what happened with evaluations, this is the percentage of teachers that did not present the tenure evaluation. As you can see, there was a big resistance from La Cente states. And thinking about what is happening right now, I mean, we don't have data for this period, but we have some idea of what's going on. We think there's a reemergence of the two tracks. After Nochixtlán, El Cente and the Ministry of Education began negotiations. And El Cente was able to put into the table some discomforts of teachers that actually were expressed by La Cente, related to the way that their wages were calculated, and even like the benefits of participating in an evaluation. I mean, those wage increases, they were done over a sueldo base, which is not over the total income. So that created a big discomfort and was affecting also their pensions. El Cente was also able to make SEP negotiate with INEE a redesign of the evaluation. So this year, last year, evaluations were voluntary, not mandatory. La Cente, from what we know, and actually we interviewed a top La Cente leader, he confirmed that, at least in the case of Chiapas, there is no education reform until 2018. And you know, if you read the minute of the minute that they filter it, they are giving like scholarships of around 7,000 pesos to students who do not pass the evaluations. So this is our assessment of the status of the education reform. yes, the constitutional reform is it's great, it's there, as also the secondary legislation, but when we start going down at the subnational level, we see some problems. Even, I mean, not only some states took a lot to adapt their legislation, but they have done it in faulty ways, against the Constitution. They are in the Supreme Court. There are constitutional controversies in the Supreme Court. And we see the major challenges in terms of implementation. That has a lot to do with, perhaps, we should discuss about the new role of federalism, because if you see the peaks that we see with the arrival of Secretary Nuño, have a lot to do because he was able to coordinate himself with all the governors, so that information regarding teachers who were not giving classes, so the SEP got that information and they began applying those sanctions. So, you know, we're also thinking that is part of the agenda related to education reform goes through union democracy. And just to finish, we also see a paradoxical effect of the center-government relationship in regards to the corporativist pact, because on the one hand, it was very useful to ensure that the education reform went through in the first stages, right? In the constitutional reform and in the secondary legislation phase. But it has been its Achilles heel during the implementation phase. So, thank you. You can reach us by email.
Okay, so after this great paper on negotiation strategies, now we're gonna hear Marco Fernandez, who's gonna talk about the financial aspect of the education reform.
Thank you so much for the invitation to present a work that is a research that is a work in progress. And the advantage of coming after Blanca and my colleagues Javier and Sebastian is that I can build in some of the aspects that they already present. I mean, the topic that I want to discuss with you is the role of federalism and the challenges for the implementation of the education reform, in which you will observe one part is related to public funds for education, but not only that, and clearly to try to assess why is it so difficult to move forward in the implementation of this reform. Very briefly, because you have seen a lot of this information. I mean, Mexico is having, I would say, three educational problems. A problem of access of educational services, both in secondary and high school. A problem of quality of education, and a problem of inequality in the access and the quality of these educational services. Here you observe that despite that in 1992 it became mandatory that secondary school should be for everyone, we still are far away of reaching that goal. Only we have a coverage of an average of 85%. And in the case of high school, this is even lower, just 54%. I'm going to skip some of the slides just in terms of that, for saving time. I mean, there are several measures that portray the problem of quality of education. I mean, clearly the most wide known is the PISA scores that Blanca referred some minutes ago, but also the new standardized testing Planea also portrays the problem of poor quality of education. Here you can see that basically none of the students or very few students have the best levels of performance in math in the standardized national test implemented in 2015, and that there is a wide variance between states. And I want to emphasize this dimension because many times when we are approaching the analysis of education reforms in general and the analysis of education reform in Mexico, we tend to forget the huge variance across the states. And if we're going to be serious about talking the challenges of implementing the reform, one of the variables, the key variables to take into account is when there are some countries that have this federalism dimension that establishes additional challenges for the correct implementation of the policies. I mean, these you have seen. Just very briefly, and I'm sure that the next presentation is going to talk much more about the results of the teacher's evaluation. But here, sorry for the poor quality of the graph, but and still, this was one of the last analyses that we did recently. Here it shows the result of the first teacher's evaluations to enter in the teacher's profession. And what I want to bring your attention to is the blue lines that show that there is a huge percentage of teachers that were in the bad performance scores to enter in the teaching profession. Clearly, I mean, despite that many have pointed out when in the controversy of the education reform that there is no quality problem of the teachers, that the teachers do not represent the main problem. I mean, if you begin to observe the results of the evaluations, you really can see that that is not the case, that we have to acknowledge that there is a huge problem of quality of our teachers. And then, all the problems that we're having, and that, let's say that is related to the three problems that I mentioned at the beginning, and that is at the core, I think, of the poor performance of the education system, is the level of corruption that exists in the education system. I mean, it's not a matter that we are spending a little bit on education, but that we have huge problems of misspending these resources. I mean, in terms of the percentage of GDP, I mean, you will see that most of the spending, I mean, 80% of the spending is public spending for education, and in terms of the GDP also, we're not spending little. We're spending 6.8%. 5.4% of those resources come from public funds, and the rest from private sources. Moreover, if we observe the evolution of this expenditure during the last basically 30 years, you will observe that there has been a growing budgets for education. And in principle, you would say, related to what we talk in the case of Peru, that should be taken with a good perception that the government is making a priority to put expenditure, education expenditure really on top. Moreover, you observe here the evolution of the teachers for elementary schools in terms of minimum days of minimum wages. And here is related to the point that my colleagues, when they talk about the union's strength, I mean, clearly, after the decentralization of education that took place in 1992, we have observed a systematic growth of teacher salaries in Mexico that unfortunately have not been accompanied by good quality results, consistent with the problem of misuse of funds for education. When finally, and I remember when we were talking about this in an old project with Barbara Bruns in Washington, I mean, back then, before 2012, we didn't have information on how many teachers were in Mexico. So as a consequence of education reform, one of the first measures that had to be implemented is to have administrative order. And therefore, there was in the law the requirement to establish an educational census. And when this educational census, the results came public, the level of the corruption just really was outrageous. I mean, at least 8% of that teacher's payroll had some kind of irregularity. I mean, people that were receiving a payment, for example, but they were not in the classroom, ghost teachers. Or people that were someone was keeping the salaries despite that person had already died. I mean, this is the kind of problems of administrative misadministration and corruption inside the education system. When you quantify those irregularities in terms of the percentage of the teacher's payroll with some kind of problem, and see like by these differences by state, and this is very key to understand related to what my colleagues talk about, the mobilizations. You observe that there are huge irregularities, not only on the typical cases that are all the time in the newspapers, like Oaxaca, Chiapas. I mean, we're talking about Querétaro, that usually is seen like an excellent state that has a lot of progress and energy because now the aerospatial industry is developing over there. Well, 23% of the teachers' payroll have some kind of irregularity. Okay? And when you try to understand what is the cost for public funds of those irregularities in terms of the percentage of budget that is allocated to primaries and secondary schools, well, in Yucatan, for example, that represented 9% of the money that goes to primaries and secondary schools. So you begin to observe that if we try to imagine the budget as a bucket, that there are huge holes in that bucket where money is channeled in an illegal way and misused. Moreover, consistent with this problem of how we spend, if we observe how the federal funds have evolved toward infrastructure, well, there has been a lot of growth. I mean, between 2000 and 2015, the federal funds for education and infrastructure grew 188%. You can see here the evolution in terms of billions of pesos. Clearly, it has been going up. Once again, you would say, those are good news. But if you begin to observe the problems of corruption, and you compare it with the state of the schools, immediately you will say where the money went to. The educational census show that at least 11% of the public schools in Mexico did not have a restroom. 22% of those schools, they have poor roofs. So how can you explain that there has been a growth in salaries, a growth in educational expenditure for infrastructure, and you have poor quality of education, and you clearly have a huge problem in the school infrastructure? Well, because of huge problems of corruption as the teachers' payroll began to show. Moreover, unfortunately, there's no people from the education minister here. I mean, the new Minister of Education has insisted that the legal payments for those commissioned people, the people that work for the union but do have a position as a teacher, and that is illegal according to the law, los comisionados del CENTE, well, that they have disappeared. An analysis that is public information shows that that is not the case. I mean, when they centralized the teachers' payroll, the promise of centralization is that there was a huge problem of corruption in the states, and that the centralization of those payments would eliminate that corruption. Well, in the first trimester of 2015, there were 897 people that were commissioned to the union. At the end of that year, there were more, 1,000. Last year, when the Minister of Education announced that for finally there was going to be a rule of law and that they were kicked out, suddenly we analyzed, and up to the last trimester of last year, now we have 3,211 people on that condition. So not only they have not disappeared, but they have increased in their number. You can see here precisely on the red bars are the commissioned of last year, and in several states that has increased. But also it's very important to understand that even given that these numbers are dramatic, we know that there is a problem, to put it very clearly, of lying of the information that the states give toward the federal authorities. Because now, supposedly, Guerrero, for example, or Chiapas, that precisely are at the core of the demonstrations, there are no commissioned. Okay? So clearly, we are making the fight right now with the state governors through the Access of Information Act to get the complete information, because this is just part of the commissioned people that works for the teachers union. Okay? There are other commissioned that are being paid with state resources, with the national budgets. And in terms of the money, you can see that unfortunately it has represented a quite considerable amount of resources. And in order to understand how this is possible, and in order to understand the challenges of how to implement, of why is it so difficult to implement education reform, we really need to take into consideration the characteristics of Mexican federalism. That is not only a matter of political will, but there are institutional characteristics that undermine the possibility of a correct coordination between the federal authorities and the subnational ones. Particularly because this reform has the huge characteristics of trying to re-centralize several aspects of education policies, such as the teacher's evaluation, but the key aspects of the reform are in hands of the subnational authorities. Okay? So I'm going to speed up because of lack of time, but here, just wanted to show you, and we're about to have the most recent numbers, but one of the promises, as my colleagues mentioned, of the reform, was that the Mexican state was going to recover the control of the educational apparatus, of the educational bureaucracy. Well, if we go and oversee we review how many of the local educational ministers and deputy secretaries are members of the union, you can see that we are far of having reached this recovery for the Mexican state of the educational infrastructure, bureaucracy, sorry. And this is key to understand also that difficulty of the implementation of key policies of teachers training, of really firing the people that apply the law. I mean, I'm in the middle of getting that information related to what you mentioned. There is no evidence, despite what the Secretary and the federal authorities have said, that people have been fired in terms of the law that 3 times, and they are they are absent of classroom 3 days in a row without just justification. The law establishes they have to be let go. There is no evidence, despite that the authorities, the previous education minister and the current education minister, of saying so many people have been fired. When we begin to observe, to ask for the database of the people fired, there is no such database. Okay? So clearly, I mean, just to move to finalize, and sorry for in the Q&A, I can go through much more detail. But one of the things that for example, in a current, as part of this study, I'm going to the States to try to, interviewing a lot of the authorities, teachers, etc. And there is a problem, a huge problem, in the coordination between the federal and the state authorities. And I just want to point out 2 examples. According to the law, the teachers' training the training for teachers, both for the new ones and the ones already in service, is a responsibility of the subnational authorities. Okay? So you would expect that the subnational authorities would have, first, the complete database of the results of the education of the teachers' evaluations in order to understand what are the kind of training that they have to develop, no? Something obvious. But they do not have, several of them do not have the complete results of the evaluation of their teachers. Second problem, the law establishes those mandatory tutorships for the new ones, but there was no federal transfers to pay for that. So the states are rebelling against this phenomenon, because of course that you can say whatever you want in the law, but if you didn't create the resources to do it correctly, and I'm sure that Lucrecia is going to talk much more about the study in that regard that she has been doing. But clearly, just these 2 examples show the challenges of this coordination, effective coordination between these 2 levels of government. So, for the future, for the coming future, one of the main problems is that many governors say that they are champions of the reform in public, but in reality, they are just, let's say, in an active strike to implement this reform. That's why our colleagues in Chiapas found what they just mentioned, that for the governor that has been talking openly in favor of the reform, he clearly is not willing to go and fight the local section of the union, and is willing to let go many of those irregularities that I just described. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marco. And our final presenter is Lucrecia.
So I'm actually just going to get started while they load this, because I think we're a little late. And just like Marco, I also did my slides in Spanish. For some reason, I thought the whole conference was in Spanish, but I'll just translate. All right, so I actually started drafting this presentation thinking back a few years ago when I was still a graduate student at Stanford. Ex-President Salinas came to Stanford, and he actually had a lunch with all the Mexican students. And so we sat around the table, and at some point he asked, he just opened it up, what do you want to ask? And I remember asking this question of him, because at that point, the decentralization reform had passed. It was one of the signature reforms of his administration. And it was clear at that point that it wasn't quite working out for education as it was intended. And so I think my question was something like, when is it justified to implement a reform even though the conditions are not there for it to succeed? When do you take advantage of political opportunity and that opportunity just takes precedent over everything else? In a way, you're putting the, what is that saying, the carriage before the horse, and you just kind of run with it and hope that at some point the horse will overtake the carriage and things will work out. And I think that I don't even remember what he answered. I remember not being very convinced about his answer, and I don't think I have the answer yet. And I think it's actually a question that sort of illustrates the tension that is the case with all of these reforms. So let me go back to that decentralization reform. And where's this clicker here? They were so happy, right? They're like, oh my God, no, Honky threw this out, and corruption will be gone, and now this young lideresa from Iztapalapa, Nezahualcóyotl, somewhere there, is going to take over and is going to just kind of, get on board with the program and things will work out. Well, the thing is that you can't really kill something and then decide a few years later you need it again, because then it kind of grows to a lot of new heads. At that point in 1992, it was, they were starting out, very visionary administration, lots of big ideas. They had this, I don't know the details of it, I'm sure there's people here that know what went on, but there was some sort of political negotiation. And I put oil prices there just because I always feel there's some economic thing in the background. I guess it's my training, so I always think like this must be something related to growth. But this was what happened there. And at that point, people who have studied this more than I felt that this decentralization, in order to get it to pass, Salinas gave teachers carrera magisterial, which at that point was a big salary bonus, and we'll talk about it in a second. So this was the opportunity, right? It was the opportunity, but the problems were, and I'm sure there are many, many more, but some of the problems were that there was just not a lot of capacity to manage at the state level, basically that they were getting the education systems. There were no transparency mechanisms at the state level to actually give an account of how they were managing that. And then finally, that you still had central finance, which, by the way, somebody here should, and I'm sure, Marco, you guys in your study look at this, but I do think the financing part plays a huge role. Unless you fix that, everything else is just kind of like unhandled. So you still had that. And so there were some of the problems. Now, in order to pass decentralization, teachers were voluntarily, they could participate in carrera magisterial, which was this merit pay incentive system. Remember, these were all technocrats in the early 90s, so they really believed in this sort of incentive mechanism. So you would get evaluation, you would get support in the form of PRONAP, which is the professional development program, and you would get a bonus. And it was a significant bonus. Teachers in the first level of carrera magisterial made about 30% higher wages, and it could go up to 150% of your base salary if you made it up to the top level. So it was not trivial. But of course, there were a lot of just design flaws in terms of not necessarily the big design. The big design was actually quite good, just in theory, but in terms of some of the details. Programa de Actualización Permanente, PRONAP, this was the professional development. It sort of was basically a disaster. It didn't quite work out. It had very little budget, and it wasn't a great program. But I'm just going to go into the next report. Obviously, the impact on quality from the few studies that have been done point to the fact that it was pretty negligible. So now today, now she's not so happy anymore. That's kind of mean, I chose kind of a bad picture of her. They were happy now. Juan Diaz, or as my colleague Alberto Servan calls him, Johnny Days. He was very happy, as was the Secretary of Education and the President. Again, another moment of a lot of political opportunity. You had, again, if you were beginning the sexenio, you had a forced, they're all forced, by the way. No one like voluntarily retires from being the center leader. This was forced in a much more dramatic fashion. She was jailed like that same day. And Mexico was kind of in an oil boom at that when the prices were really high. the reform was kind of, it shared some similar elements to the previous reform. It was, again, these two pillars of evaluation, accountability, and support. Now, there was a big difference, of course. It was not voluntary anymore. And it was not actually tied to salary bonuses. So now, instead of giving you like a big prize at the end, you could actually be sanctioned. So it was sort of the opposite. In a way, I think that this reform was, I was trying to think, Blanca, when you were saying like they got this in order to pass the other reforms, I thought, well, this is not like a pretty sweet deal, it's actually pretty hard on the teacher. So I think, yeah, it's like a bitter one, yeah. All right. So I'm going to focus today actually not on teacher evaluation. I kind of changed my mind when I was presenting this because I didn't have a lot of new things to say about teacher evaluation, partly because it's very hard to do those studies right now. The data access is very, very limited, so it's kind of hard to say something empirical about it. But I was fortunate enough last year to do a study on the professional development part of the Reforma, and I want to acknowledge Marisol Vasquez here and Daniela Rubio, who were my co-authors on that study, funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, so thank you. And some participants from INA, Juliana, some were there, and some other people. So what we tried in this study, this was at the very beginning of the Estrategia Nacional de Formación Docente, which Aurelio Nuño announced in March. I'll go into it in a little bit. What our study tried to do is just try to see what were some design elements. Does this thing kind of make sense just from the design aspect? And how is implementation going in the States? It was not an evaluation. I actually tried really hard not to even call it an evaluation because the States were really only beginning to set this up. So it was kind of unfair to them to come and see, oh, it worked, it didn't work, since they had only started. And we were also going to compare some of these design elements to what the literature said worked. Now, admittedly, and some of you in the room here have done a lot of work on that, there's not a ton of literature on this, right? So there's a few experiences here and there. We investigated Chile quite a bit, but that was a little bit disappointing because a lot of their studies say, well, this is not really implemented in the way we wanted it, so there's just few places to look to, but we tried. We started our work, the timeline is important here, in July. The strategy was officially announced in March, but the universities that were going to deliver the professional development weren't actually convocados until May. And there were not even reglas de operación in place. And this created enormous problems to actually pay people who were getting the courses, pay the tutors, pay everybody, because there were no legal mechanisms to actually establish transfers between states and the federal government. I'll talk a little bit more about that. We did a qualitative study. We visited 10 states. We did a ton of interviews. Marisol and Daniela did most of them. Focus groups, and we talked to the institutes of higher education that provide these courses. To give you, just because we don't have a lot of time, I'll just say it briefly, this is a mostly online professional development strategy. Teachers can take any course they want. It's actually about 100% of it is online, but they have to implement some sort of project in their school. So if you look at the design, and I think this goes back to something either Marco or Javier said, it actually doesn't look that bad. I mean, our authorities, whoever's writing these policies, they do their research, they read the papers, they know kind of what's trendy and what's going on. So a lot of these design elements, and I'll highlight a few in a second, actually do agree with this. And let me highlight a few here. So one of the things that the literature says is that you have to have active learning, not just sitting and listening to somebody, but actually like doing something in practice. And so they have this proyecto del aula, which they have to come up with a problem in their classroom and do something and then produce some improvement. It has to be focused on actual content. So there's some of that. I mean, there's a lot of courses. There's like 500 courses in the catalog, so there's a lot of math and Spanish and all of that. They are about 40 hours, which is around the minimum that you would want courses to be. And because the teachers have the result of their evaluation, there is some idea that they know what they need. So there's, you're not just kind of randomly choosing courses, but you can do it. And it has a mentor component that Marco already alluded to. So it doesn't look that bad, right? When you look at it, you're like, okay, it makes kind of sense. But of course, as the cliche goes, the devil's in the details, and there's just a lot of unresolved tension that ends up not working out in practice. One of the issues has to be with the resources. So now, it used to be that the states manage their own budgets for professional development, but now everything is spent centrally because the Federation, La Federación, pays the institutions directly. And so they never manage any budgets at the state level except a really, really little part of it. States complain that the courses don't meet their needs, that they're not adapted to the realities. But then it's kind of funny because you ask them, well, do you have like an actual diagnosis of what your needs are? And no one can actually produce any systematic. But I don't know, they have some anecdotal evidence that the courses don't meet their needs. Oh, very importantly, the authorities can't actually even see the courses. They don't know what the content of the courses is. They can go to the website, just like you and I can go, and they can see the titles of the courses, but they don't actually know what's offered in the courses. So there's, not a lot of room there to be doing, some more policy at the state level and to be coming up with a diagnosis of whether things work or not. And there's a very, very big lack of resources, and I don't mean just financial resources, I mean like human resources. When we interviewed the person who was heading the Estrategia Nacional, the top professional development guy at the national level from SEP, which, by the way, I just heard he was removed, he was changed now, I know. So this guy comes from Monterrey, he used to be the minister there. I am agnostic as to whether the guy is good or not, but he's brought, I think in December, to start working on this, but he's not officially named. So he can't sign anything. He cannot sign any oficios or anything that would actually, everything in Mexico functions in this very formal way. If you don't get an oficio telling you that you have to do whatever, it doesn't really exist. I mean, you can do it, but you don't have to. When the estrategia was announced, he didn't have I don't think he wasn't even being paid, I think, because he didn't even have like an actual thing. And he had at that point 2 people working under him as subdirectores that had like an actual civil service position and were being paid. And he convinced 2 other people from Monterrey to come here, work by honorarios, like consultants, and didn't get paid for months. So at some point, the guy looks visibly frustrated. He's like, I'm operating this huge thing, 32 states, with basically 6 people. Those 4 people and then 2 jefes de department. So you begin to wonder, as Marco said, how can you, this is the support pillar of the reforma. You're telling teachers that you're going to evaluate them, that you may fire them, they may not, but you're going to give them all this support. And all this support is being managed by 6 people who are not even getting paid, half of them, right? So that already in and of itself kind of makes you really puzzle and wonder how people make decisions in that top level. This is the same chart I showed you. I took a few rows out because I didn't want to spend too much time on it. But this is what we found actually in the field. So aprendizaje activo, which sounds great and exciting and we all want to be a part of it. Who knows whether that's happening? Because there's not actually any mechanism to control quality and to actually see what these projects are, who's running them, who's providing feedback. I mean, anybody who's taught at any level of education knows that feedback is a crucial part of it. I mean, I can do any project I want, but I need to be told, am I in the right direction? Am I missing something? Should I go back and do something? This feedback is being given by the institution's facilitadores, who are not professors at TEC de Monterrey or UNAM, but are a person with 3 years teaching experience. In the case of TEC, they do have a master's degree, but in the other universities, they have a bachelor's degree. And these facilitadores are in charge of 50 teachers, providing feedback, helping them, guiding them. It's probably a lot, and we don't even know how they're doing it. Focalización del contenido curricular. Well, teachers can choose whatever they want, so we don't know what they're choosing, right? We hope that they have an incentive to choose where they're weak. But I'll show you something that kind of puts that into question. And then the tutoring part, which by the way is one of the areas that the literature does say has some evidence to support teacher improvement. Well, this part is a huge mess because the tutors didn't get paid and so they couldn't recruit anybody. And I don't have time to go into it, but if anyone wants to know more, this has become like a little passion of mine now after studying this. All right, so this is the thing about this tie between the professional development and the evaluation. 3 minutes, okay. Part of the promise of this reform was that the evaluation was going to give you a lot of information about how you were doing, and based on that, the secretary promised you would get traje a la medida, right? Well, I guess in our world, we basically have small, medium, and large, because it's really not like you can do a lot with these evaluations. Let me show you. You can't see anything here, but I just wanted to show you this is a scan from an actual report that teachers get. I'm gonna in the next slide, I'll highlight the things that I want you to look at. This is an actual expediente diagnóstico that somebody who got an insufficient result got. And this is what it's telling them. You organize your practice with limited knowledge about content. Who knows what content? Is it all content? Some content? I don't know. That's your diagnosis. You utilize educational materials that are not relevant. You pick activities that promote inclusion. I guess this is, you can't be all bad, so it's like a good thing. And you show limited use of like search and selection of materials for your own professional development. That's the diagnosis. And then it gives you a set of recommendations. And the recommendations is go get those abilities that you don't have. Diversify the use of schooling materials. I don't know, I would be confused if I got a recommendation to actually do inclusion because you just told me that I was good at that. But I guess you can't, there's room for growth. And then finally, get better at like searching the web and getting stuff. Now, based on that, tutors, higher education institutions are supposed to design a course for whatever it is that you need. Now, if this is the tool we are using to base like our professional development strategy, it's pretty limited, I think, in what it can offer. I don't have to tell you that the implementation, I don't know if it's just that Mexicans, like we, for some reason, like can't implement stuff. Like I'm seriously thinking there's something wrong because it's like Groundhog Day. We keep hearing design is okay, everything works out, but it breaks down when you actually try to land it. In this case, there was just not a lot of the paperwork and the legislations in place. And then also, I think it's this tension that Marco highlighted of keeping control, but actually telling the states that they have to do a lot of stuff. And I've been at meetings at the Ministry of Education where they call all the secretaries of education and not all of them show up. So this is not a world where they're going to be marching to whatever you tell them. And you're going to love this book, but I'm going to have to say it in Spanish because it has a lot more punch. This is from one of our interviews, and I think it completely sums up this tension. Dice, yo sostengo el criterio que en el lenguaje cotidiano y en la práctica operativa de la reforma, y a la hora en la que estallan los conflictos, las cosas se resuelven con esta frase. Yo, federación, tengo la norma, tengo el recurso, y tu entidad tiene la operación de la reforma, es decir, tú tienes la bronca. Esta situación nos manda a dos escenarios, una centralización de recursos y la normatividad y una descentralización de las mentadas de mano. Esas le quedan a la entidad. And I really think this sums up why this is not working out. He's from Tabasco, of course. All right, so I'm going to end there. I just had a few food for thought. Why do things break down? Why do they not put resources in it? Or capacity, not even financial resources, just capacity. Why do we keep kind of hearing, why is this the story every time over and over again? And is it possible to not, for us to generate political opportunity and not just kind of be a window that opens up every 6 years when you're starting out as president and you want to do everything before, I don't know, people kind of realize you're actually going to do a lot of the things you said you would do. Like, is there a place where you can actually generate this opportunity? Thanks.
finally, please, Carlos, we'd love to hear your comments.
No. Gracias, Juan. Thank you, Juan. I think everyone made its presentation in Spanish because the mood of the time is Mexico first. So I can speak Spanish, but I won't because I know there are some guys from outside of the US that don't speak Spanish, so it would be unfair. But you by now are probably confused, as I am, about the complexities of this reform. I'm probably extremely tired as well because it's been a very long session. So I will try to be brief, trying to answer three main questions, which I think are the guiding elements in this presentation. The first one, which is basically what Blanca did, why did it happen? The second one, can it be implemented? And the third one, which is more perspective, which was not really touched by any one of you, but I think it's critical, will it be sustained? Because politics in Mexico is cyclical. Every 6 years, things change. So let me move very quickly to the first of the questions. Why did it happen? I think Blanca has a very good general framework. I think the story she tells is very good. But I would underscore something I think she didn't say, with the emphasis needed, which is, this is just a minute reform of an extremely ambitious set of reforms that took place in Mexico when President Peña arrived. So that helps explaining many things, among others, why can they take care of it as it should, because it's just one of many other reforms that took place. So the first question is, why suddenly a priista from the state of Mexico? As you know, the state of Mexico is this huge state that surrounds Mexico City, which has always been governed by priistas. When you go there, in political terms, it's like going 50 years back into the past. Why a guy that was governor from there, suddenly comes to the presidency and becomes the most modernized president in history? Salinas is just a baby compared to what Peña Nieto did. And secondly, this guy arrives without controlling any of the legislative chambers. And according to everything that was said during the Panistas government from the year 2000 to the year 2012, for the first time ever, we had presidents that didn't come from the pre-Panistas, they didn't have the control of the legislative either. And my colleagues here at SIDA and other places concluded that with a divided government, it was impossible to make reforms. So this is the first starting contradiction. A priista from the state of Mexico with divided government suddenly managed to do a Pacto for Mexico, which includes, and very quickly try to explain when Blanca said, confronting poderes fácticos, powerful interest group, what does that mean? In 1 year, this government made several constitutional reforms. The first one, changing, in terms of importance, not of order, it's very complex how they were negotiated, and just to portray very quickly what it meant. Mexico had the energies, in terms of its laws, the closest energy system of the world. North Korea was more open in terms of what could you do in terms of oil, and it's not metaphorical, it's right, it's very specific. We had lived with that obscene and extremely inefficient system for decades, and it seemed almost impossible to change it. It was in the in-laws of the pre that you cannot change that. And they changed it. And what is more interesting, it's more or less working. But that's a difference. But we have to confront not only the powerful trade union of Pemex, but the whole ideology, nationalistic ideology of Mexico first, which we invented in the 30s, but that was so important in cementing this contract of the revolution. So they did that. They confronted in the same reform both the richest Mexican, and at that time the richest man in the world, Carlos Slim, and the very powerful television monopolies. They confronted with a reform that created a new antitrust authority all the major businessmen most of which made their money abusing of their market power. They did the educational reform, they changed the electoral rules in such a way that the whole process was centralized to avoid the control of state governors over the process. They created an autonomous institution, which is still on the making, to confront corruption, and I could go on. It's important to have this in mind, because then the whole mechanics of the reform changed in a way, which is, as Blanca said, it was a chip, but it was a chip of very large gain. First thing. Second thing, you saw the numbers of PISA. PISA, and in general terms, as Marco very correctly portrayed, was such a disaster. The educational system in Mexico was such a disaster that there was an agreement among all parties, pre-included, that you had to do something there. So more than a bargaining chip, I think that educational reform was more of a cement of the whole pact. There were 2 or 3 things where all of them agreed. This reform was passed almost, in Mexico, most important things have to be changed, imply changing the constitution. For strange constitutional reasons, our constitution is extremely detailed, so many of the things that were needed, as they explained the political mechanics, but they didn't really go into the constitutional details. But in terms of doing this reform, you have to change the constitution, but the same applies to all the other reforms. So some of them, like this one, was almost approved with unanimity. Only by then, because it was the beginning of sexenio, PRD, a left-wing party, have abandoned Observador. Observador didn't have a party yet. It was basically an unanimous approval of this reform. So the idea of bargaining chip is not exactly. I mean, there was this pressure, in a way thanks to Mexicanos Primero, which is standing there, but this idea that we had a disaster, we had to fix it, and the only way of fixing it was through merit-based reform, and it was very well explained. So for me, the main puzzle is not educational reform, but reform in general. Why suddenly these guys that could exactly, which come from very different view of the world, decide to modernize the whole country. And I think that the story is more or less the following. It has to do a little bit with what Blanca said, but it's in a slightly different emphasis. There was this agreement that if this reform were undertaken, we would be able to underpass our stagnated growth. We did NAFTA. If you hear Trump, you might believe that Mexico has been growing in an amazing way thanks to South NAFTA, but it's not the case. We've been growing in a very mediocre way. Some states in the north have gained much more than others, but on average, Mexican economic growth has been around 2.4 for the past 3 decades, from NAFTA, prior to NAFTA, but in the last 3 decades. So there was this agreement, even among the left, that you had to do a set of reforms suggested by OECD, etc., that would allow you to grow. So the idea is to embrace this package at the beginning of the sexennium, you pay the cost, and at the end, you stand gaining from it. And educational reform perhaps had a longer period of maturity, but you could put it into this package, was very popular. If you look at opinion polls, one of the reforms that was most popular was educational reform. So all of them were winning in a way. Of course, the trade union was unhappy. It's already been explained. Well, when one of our speakers said that the trade union had moral leaders, it was a literal translation that shouldn't be taken very seriously. Moral, not in the sense that they were guys with a lot of morality, but what they meant is that even they were not the actual general secretaries of the state of the trade union, they were actually the guys that managed the trade union, because the actual leaders changed a lot. So erase this idea of moral leaders, because they are much better in jail than anywhere else. But the idea is that, of course, trade unions were unhappy, and you had this extremely powerful and cohesive political class confronting all these powerful interests at the same time, and no one wanted to blockade this. A little bit like Trump, but with real support. At the beginning of our process of reform, no one wants to be the one that confronts, and the fact that El Bester is in jail is because she was the only one that tried. And after she tried and failed, the whole political game changed very dramatically. But that's the easy part of any reform. The difficult one is how do you actually implement it. And the complexity of our bureaucracy, of our legal system, of our distribution of power is such that the secretary in charge decided basically not to do anything. The first secretary, Cholfet, basically thought, perhaps after reading Blanca's paper, what's the gain of this reform? Let's not do anything. Of course, he was sacked for that very same reason, but that's another problem. So the politics of implementing this reform then depends a lot on who is in charge, and in the Mexican political cycle, how well you are moving into your real target, which is winning the candidacy of your party. And Joffre thought he could win by doing nothing. There was this old saying in Mexico, el que se mueve no sale en la foto. He who moves won't be taken in the picture. So he decided not to move much in order to survive politically, which was not the case, but that's a different story. But imagine that this is being done at the same time that the other reforms are being implemented as well. And to make things much more complex, we started, and it's good that you put the oil price there, we started with an oil price of 100 more or less per barrel. In January of last year, the oil price was $18. So the whole thing starts to unravel because the fiscal equilibrium that this political system managed after investing in a very complex fiscal reform in order to have extra resources both to implement the reforms and to be able to create a coalition, patronage, etc. This collapsed because the oil price collapsed. The only strange thing is that the peso didn't collapse prior to Trump. I mean, it's because of the fiscal reform they were able to compensate the collapse of the oil price, but they suddenly got no extra money to actually fund the complexities of this reform. At the same time, because of the decentralization of power in Mexico, states in Mexico are constitutionally very powerful, governors are in fact very powerful, although the institutions of these states are very weak. So you have a lot to explain state by state, depending on the governor, its capacity to actually implement the reform, its willingness to do it, whether he's there in a long-term project or just wanting to steal money, as many of them do. So then you have the specific collapses or capacities in each state, which a little bit market or trade based on a local logic, which makes understanding the reform very complex. So implementing it is difficult because it's very complex, because the bureaucratic capacities of the educational sector is very low, because each time you do these reforms, you basically end having to use money to drive the trade union. One of the graphs, the one you presented, the centralization means more money to the system because it was the only way to actually placate the forces that have been liberated because of the reform. So now the big dilemma this government has is it doesn't have more money to placate the trade union. It needs a lot of money to implement it because it's a much more complex reform than the previous one, which was basically this idea of carrera magisterial, which I know because my mother was teacher then. She applied for the carrera magisterial and she failed. So I probably, it's basically not meritocratic at all. You needed a lot of contacts in that trade union to actually get that money. Now I think that the good news is, although slowly, with all the problems that they've told and many others could tell, the basic logic of meritocracy is much more internalized in the system than in any other reform. So for me, the big question is whether this will be maintained in the next 6 years. No matter how complex this reform is, it puts in a correct track the basic logic the educational system should have. The problem being, however, that the only not party, that political activist, it wasn't a party then, that didn't approve the reform, López Obrador, that now has a party, and it's the candidate which currently seems more likely to win the next presidential election, and he has been openly against this reform. He does not approve at all at its basic tenet, which is meritocracy. He thinks that's a technocratic invention to fire people, maybe it is as well, but what is clear is that if he were to win, even though it would be complex for him to change the constitution that mandates him to do this, these reforms require a lot of political will, and it's unlikely that will take place. I will very quickly make just an addendum before finishing, which is, although it was portrayed here very well, I would like to expand a little bit more. La Gente is basically a revolutionary group. They are not into the business of managing education, they are into the business of trying to transform social conditions in the south of Mexico, gaining as much political power and economic resources as possible. But they are extremely ideological, they are extremely powerful, and in those states, what we've been seeing is governors are accommodating to La Gente in order to pacify the states and the conflict. The charts that Sebastian and Javier showed you didn't distinguish between La Gente and El Gente. Most of the activity is La Gente, which in terms of the percentage of the members of the union is minute, but it's much smaller, but they were able to create havoc in Mexico City and its surrounding. And I think that governments basically were trying to contain as much as possible. In Oaxaca, they basically reversed, I think, the whole education, the whole reform. In other states, they managed to maintain certain of its basic elements. But then you go to Lucrezia's argument that actually doing all those things needed to reform the quality of the professors and the whole logic behind the mechanism needed to actually fulfill the meritocratic logic is extremely complex, and we are far away from actually doing it well. So with this I will finish because I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and thanks a lot for the invitation. I should have started with that. It's been a privilege to be here and discuss this issue. Thank you very much.
Well, we are behind schedule. We've been behind schedule since we started. But I think we still have time for a few questions, right? Maybe 15, 20 minutes. It's right now? My bad. Jokes are not in the time of it. Okay, so 15 minutes. So questions. Go on. We'll pack the three together in a moment.
Okay, so my question is, I guess, for all of you. Although it's inspired by the 2 tracks presentation. I guess I just want you guys to talk a little bit more. Is it the case that El Cinte didn't resist at all? I mean, when you guys talk about the governors and accommodating the union resistance, is that all La Cinte states? So, yeah, that's it.
Thanks. This is a question for all the panel. I would like to see what you think. So, if we turn to the most successful education reform that is similar to the one that we're trying to implement in Mexico, in the region has been Chile. What we heard this morning was that Chile, a country that has a much stronger institutional development vis-a-vis Mexico, they started with a reform where the evaluation of teachers was not mandatory. It was an evaluation that was on a voluntary basis. Once they created this psychology or psychological acceptance that merit was driving the selection and the promotion in the education system, then they moved into making it mandatory. So what would you think of, just think about 2018, what would you think about transiting into a much more let's say, a less confrontational approach where we start making this voluntary. And this is related to Blanca's statement. She finalized saying that nobody gained from this reform, which I respectfully disagree. I think that just having all these rules that are sending a very clear message that we're trying to move to a merit-based approach, that in itself, it's something that I, as a Mexican, value. And also there is some evidence that even with a very faulty merit-based selection process of President Calderon, that had an effect on student learning outcomes. I'm sure you know the paper of Ricardo Estrada. Yeah, so we do gain, and I think it's all a responsibility to shout that in all fora that this is something that we, the society at large, we do gain, although we are not very well organized, certainly not as well organized as the union. Thanks.
One last question.
So I guess this question is for all, but maybe for Lucrecia, yeah, more than anyone. It seems to me that when implementation capacity is low, which you've given plenty of evidence, you have two choices. You can either try to increase the implementation capacity so that it matches the design complexity, or you can lower the design complexity so that it matches the implementation capacity. And this goes a little bit along the lines of what Rafael has said. It seems to me that after really a couple of decades of reform experience, enough evidence has accumulated that the capacity to implement a complex reform is just not there. And you can't grow it quickly. And it's not just a matter of money, because it's a matter of skill. And at the same time, I would suggest that, again, using either Chile as an example or other reforms in other countries, that while improving teaching is complex, there's a tendency to over-design teacher evaluations and to over-design the in-service support by making it too philosophical. It shouldn't be about you need to search for better ways to motivate the inner child and this kind of. It's you're forgetting to teach place value. Here's how you teach place value. And so the question after all that is, why is there a tendency, which seems to be recurrent in Mexico, to over-design relative to the implementation capacity? And wouldn't an idea for reform be to design less, to design less complex things?
Okay, someone wants to start. I don't know, it's under-design. Should we? Okay, let's take one more, but I don't want to take too many because then it won't remember.
Just want to say something in response to what Rafa and Luis said, and maybe Emiliano remembers more clearly, but it was not a big time lapse between voluntary moving to mandatory teacher evaluations in Chile, but it was a smaller part of the teaching force. This was only in the municipal schools. I think a better example for Mexico is Peru, which is basically trying to do the same kind of huge change on the same kind of fairly compressed timetable. And maybe Jaime can talk a little bit about how they've been handling implementation challenges. But I guess my question is, I'd love to see the members of the panel and any other knowledgeable Mexicans in the room vote on how likely it is that this reform will be sustained 3 years from now.
Like a real, like that's up. I'm just curious, yeah. Like kind of DC
of the questions or just? Okay. Well, I'll just start with Luis' question about whether we, the over-design. I think probably I don't know, like I said, I think this requires a lot more analysis, but I do think that a lot of these reforms are designed centrally by a group of very capable people who actually know what they're doing, and they've read all the literature and they talk really high level, but a lot of them have actually never been to a state, and probably don't recognize how much it takes to implement a lot of these things that seem pretty evident to them. So I think there's a level of disconnect between what's happening centrally and what's happening in the states. I also think that a lot of these things, you do lose, a lot of these things are predicated on the fact that, whoever is not evaluated is going to be removed. But the federal government is not doing the removal of the teachers, because they're not their teachers, they're employees of the state. So in a way, you can't get the 32 states to be on board with you, and we know from a lot of experience that they flip all the time. You're putting a lot of chips in that basket and it may not even pan out. I think that I do think it's too much. I do think they should probably do less, because what ends up happening is that the states actually do less. Everybody kind of ignores the things they can't do. I think the reform in Mexico has suffered other blows to it that are internal. From just, for example, the evaluations themselves. There were problems like computers failing and people not being able to upload, things that really hit the process. You're spending so much political capital, you're reforming the Constitution, and then it breaks down because you can't upload like 3 megas, like that's what's going to hit you at the end. So I think some of these things are way too ambitious for infrastructure. And just to comment very quickly on Rafa's and Barbara's point, I don't know if a less confrontational approach, Rafa, would work, because Carrera Magisterial was voluntary. It was completely non-confrontational. It gave teachers huge bonuses. They could do it if they wanted, not do it if they did, and it still didn't work. We saw no effects. So honestly, if I were like in charge of something, I would almost like throw my hands in the air as to the teachers who are now there, and I would concentrate on the new teachers, where you can actually make some changes in the teacher training, in the selection of teachers. Because if you're not going to be willing to fire those teachers at the end of the day, like if you're not going to be willing to do the full extreme of what this takes, by the way, I'm not suggesting that that's the way you should be, but it would be like the ultimate consequence.
No, but the reform is not even those that are failing 3 times in a row. They will be separated.
Well, they would be separated from the class. Right. Right, but look at that in itself, it's like, so what, are you going to just send them to some rubber room? Like what is going to happen, right? So I don't know. Barbara, honestly, I think if Lopez Obrador wins, this is not going to continue. And I actually do think we should think about whether it should continue or not. I don't think we should just say like, oh, it sounds great and we should do it. I think it has exposed a lot of flaws in the system, and at some point you have to stop saying, well, it works in theory, but we just need to fix the practice. Well, if it hasn't worked in practice for a very long time, maybe something's wrong at the design level as well.
Should I go next? I will focus on 2 questions. The first one, so what has El CENTE done throughout this time? Well, the first thing that El CENTE did actually cost Maestra Gordillo Morales, her freedom. When the reform started, she pronounced completely against the fact about taking tenure out of teachers in service, and actually that really cost her freedom. Yeah. So that was the first thing that they tried to do. Then later, when they were discussing how the professional teacher service was going to work, something that has been mentioned here, meaning teachers in service who fail the evaluations are not fired. They have 3 opportunities, and if they are not doing well, they end up in administrative or clerical duties. So that's a way that they try to, defend the teachers. Something that has, this is the nice side of the story. At the national level, for instance, I'm actually doing research on how states have harmonized or adapt their state legislation, to make sure that they comply with the constitutional requirements. I've seen, for instance, that in some states they create some union committees to ensure that the evaluations go well, or they have created their own teachers' careers service, So they've done some stuff. And we look to the bad things. The way that they are giving the reform is not going to work. For instance, yes, in order to access the teaching profession, you have to pass some examinations. But one way that they have been getting control of the system is that there are some interimantes, I don't know how to say that in English, interim positions, and also those of the teachers who retire. What they do is they basically hire whomever they want, the union members, and once they are there, well, you've been here for more than 6 months, it's for you. So yeah, the CENTE has done stuff. About how likely the reform is going to, if it's going to be sustained, I have my reservations. I think that it's going to be sustained in the 2 tracks, in the best scenario. Why? Because, thinking about the case of Chiapas, where, I have confirmation that it's not going to operate there. Well, a new governor is going to really go against the teachers in his first term? I don't think so. So, and if López Obrador wins, then the reform, it might be dead, but who knows?
I'm going to try to summarize several of the points that were asked. First of all, the main challenge, I think, is really to understand education reform in the context of the political system. It is a mistake to study just education policy without really understanding the relationship of the union to the political system. And if we really do not take that into consideration, we are just very naive in approaching education policy. What does it mean? It means to understand, for example, why is it the case that the governors are willing to concede key educational positions in the ministries? Well, because they receive votes, because they calm down mobilizations in the institutional states. That's why you have a lot of commissioning people. The tolerance toward those illegal payments are behind that way to try to buy peace on the streets. That's the first thing. Second thing, I remember back then when we were discussing this in Washington, there are these 2 ideal ways to approach reform: confrontational or with cooperation. The reform with Calderon was cooperation and didn't work. This reform is confrontation and it doesn't seem to be working. Okay? So let me just to put that in perspective. You were in the education ministry. Remember, it was cooperation. And they concede a lot of things to the union. And unfortunately, exactly. So in that sense, we have to be careful, but we have to recognize one key issue, that if there is no state capacity, how are you going to implement such a complex reform as this one? And Mexico, that's why I said political system, has a huge problem of state capacity in many aspects of policy. So, education is one. We're seeing it in the security, we're seeing in many aspects of health, in terms of fighting corruption effectively. So, I have been thinking this is very important question. I said, okay, how do you tackle this challenge? And in that sense, I really think that, yes, it's little by little. You have to establish pockets of excellence in the education ministries in order to have good staff for teachers training, for operating that. Otherwise, I mean, it's a nonsense to have teachers evaluation without the follow-up that is key, good training in order to have an impact on the classroom. Then, in that sense, just the other question that I wanted to answer is the strategy. We have to understand that menu of tools that the union has to influence education policy. It is not only protests and strikes, but it's capturing key positions of teachers of that educational infrastructure that they have been very effective of keeping many of those positions. They have been capable of retaining teachers' positions that should be subject to contest in their control. And in that, the authority, both the federal and the subnational, are responsible because they don't understand that transparency is their best tool to fight these kind of practices. I mean, we do not have access to the order of the allocation of teaching positions according to the teachers' evaluations. That is the promise of the reform. So, yes, there is an element of merit, but we do not know if that has been fulfilled. And just an example of that, precisely because of the controversy of the commissioning. Last year, the government decided first at the federal level and then the subnational ones followed. The several of the commissioners should be returned toward the schools. In this highly visible program called La Escuela al Centro. And they appointed those commissioners as these adjunct principals, subdirectores, without subjecting those positions to an open contest. That violates the law and contradicts the spirit that you are trying to send, that is the merit, what really matters for you to go up in the teacher's profession. And last but not least, also precisely to understand all this complexity of the reform, the governors are not willing to cooperate because in the education, in the implementation of the reform, they have lost huge amount of money. I promise 1 minute to explain this. There is something called economías. In other words, there were teachers. When you were a teacher, and you had, because of age or because of the carrera magisterial, a better salary, and you retired with that salary, let's say 6,000 pesos, 60,000 pesos, 60,000 pesos. When that retiree left the position, it used to be the case that the state authority used the position, open it to contest, but as an initial wage, let's say 10,000, and the difference, they kept, the state governors kept it to finance several things in the education ministry. With the centralization of that payroll, that difference of money was given back to the federal authorities. And this represents a huge amount of money. So governors, of course, they are pissed off because of this. Because on top of that, the new regulation, the new law, establishes that those in charge of providing the training, the tutorships for teachers, are the subnational authorities. But there is no federal transfer to finance those things. So you lose money, and you have another additional cost for your budget. So do you really think that you're going to be cooperating for this reform? That on top of that, when there are protests, they are in your state, and if they send the federal police, you have to pay for the cost of sending that federal police? That's why it's so difficult to move forward in this reform, and I insist that's why we need to understand it in the whole context of the political system.
Just very quickly try to answer your question, Luis, because I think it's critical. With so weak capacities, where do we always end with these complex reforms? And I think that the way they were negotiated obliged us to enter in this way. Let me explain it. Because these three parties were exchanging things. Each one had a new idea on how to make the reform, energy or whichever better. And so all the reforms are more complex than they should. The competition and telecommunication reform, the constitutional reform, has more words than the US Constitution. Just to give you a very quick idea of. And then of course you have to manage it. But also the idea is, it's very difficult to change the constitution. This is a moment where we should freeze the rules of the game. And so everyone wants to make sure that you freeze it with as many details as possible. And then you end with these very strange and stupid things that are unmanageable. But at the political exchange, it makes sense. And second, I would argue, and it's a little bit more complex, but very quickly, the capacity of this new government in terms of, the technocratic capacity of this new government is very limited. And therefore, they didn't realize the complexities they were signing into. They were used to manage a state where you can really basically do whatever you want, the law is just a suggestion, the bureaucracy is completely on your pocket, and then you move to the federal government and things are much more complex. And then you end with something that is untractable. We created how many autonomous institutes? Like 7 or 8. Another aspect very interesting of this reform is, as you don't trust the bureaucracy, you don't trust the politicians, we have to create autonomous institutions in charge of the implementation of these reforms. And so that when you say it's autonomous in a big way, it's in the constitution. They have the authority to define its own budget, they cannot be fired under any circumstance. And you did that in many other areas. And so you also lost the capacity to coordinate these very complex reforms. And finally, I would like try to distinguish two types of reforms. The energy reform is relatively easier, in spite of having to reform these two monopolies, CFE and Pemex, because you basically eliminated restrictions. While here, you have to reconstruct the relation between teachers and bureaucracy, and that's of enormous complexity.
Yeah, it's the same sense in which macroeconomic reform is relatively easy.
Exactly. And I'm sorry, I'll have to leave. Thank you.
Sustainability?
Sustainability.
Sustainability, if Lopez reaches to power, as I said, I don't think it will be sustainable. But a la mexicana, moving the constitution is difficult, he probably just don't do much.
Yeah, I'm an optimist, deep down, and I would like to think that at least some parts could be salvaged, but it's going to be very difficult. But let me just go to some of Rafa's questions specifically. Perhaps I did not make myself clear, or I think we are in agreement. There have been gains and there have been winners in a sense, but there's not enough winners that even perhaps see themselves as such, so as to go out and defend the reform, and that concerns me. And it seems to me that that is and if I were in government, in charge of this, I would give that super high priority if I wanted it to be sustained. Because not only did you start off with the very big opposition, SENTE has followed along, but not happily. Many of these teachers are dragging their feet, or these union leaders, and because of the reasons pointed out by Marco, so you don't have a lot of people that are mobilized positively in favor of the reform. And it seems to me that makes it easier for López Obrador or whomever, that is not as interested to come in and just, push it away. So that, the kind of thing that Jaime was sharing with us about how, you got students and parents, in particular parents or teachers, to become more actively, for the reform, I think is critically important. And finally, on the voluntary thing, the model, I'm concerned about the voluntary because of the nature of how implementation in a context that is where bureaucracies, some of the bureaucracies are so intensely politicized. And so this would be a possibility of just muddling through and simulation, things like that. My own take on this is I think that we should go gradual and we should focus on defending two things at this point in terms of merit-based teaching or accession: entry and promotion. For me, those are the battles right now. We should really, I think, in my opinion, we have disagreements and you've studied this for a long time, but I don't think the design itself of the performance part is good enough. It certainly has not brought in any kind of buy-in on the part of teachers, and that must be part of your design. Otherwise, it's not going to work, and it did not create a real career. I'm not going to go into the details, but I've said it. More than voluntary, I now say, let's defend entry and promotion.
Good, let's start a coalition.
Okay, and on that note, I think we're all tired, and thank you all. Let's
Have some wine.
a round of applause for the presenters.